What they like to do is start history at 1492, and then we have the Spanish Golden Age, right? We got to take you back 50 years so you can understand not only what the exiles were really about in Spain and Portugal, but in that same time frame, Columbus in 1492 goes to the Americas, right? You have to know why the Vatican decides to give the Treaty of Tordesillas, where they split the world for Portugal and Spain. If you know these things, then you know what the actual phrase colonialism by exile really means. And then when you understand that, you understand Israel, you understand Australia, you understand all the people looking for religious freedom in world history, and you understand what's really been happening here, okay? Now, let's get started with the pre-1492 decades. Let's take a look at the map. So in 1420, Portuguese start to find islands like Madeira and Azores, right? And they also got Cape Verde in 1456. But then in 1457, the Catholic Church legalizes slavery. Why did they do that? Because the Portuguese had just discovered islands where they could start shipping people, and they also were raiding the coast in the 1440s and kidnapping slaves. Okay, children usually, 8 to 12. Now, this is after that Arabic Jewish era, or the very end of it, and it'll be right before Europe takes full control of Portugal and Spain again through the Habsburg lines. But that 700 to 1400 AD era, don't forget, that's an all Jewish Arab Spain. You understand that? It's millions of Arabs and millions of Jews. So when you hear Sephardic and Ashkenazi and they're split, a lot of that is from the split in Spain. Okay? There are earlier splits, like we discussed earlier, where they left from the Roman exile and from Babylonian exiles and other exiles where they went up north several different times. But now after they discover these islands, and they discover all the plentiful things that they can find over here, the Portuguese and the Spaniards started creating little colonies and ports along the coast. And at this point, they're just kidnapping and raiding, okay? Now, it's funny that after they discover that, and after the Vatican legalizes slavery, within 30 years, you have the Spanish exile in 1492. That same year, Christopher Columbus, whose name is Christopher Colon, asked the Vatican, whose highest nobility, and one of the two families that can pick popes, essentially, by selecting the cardinals of the Vatican. Only the Colonna and the Orsini could do that since the 1300s. Colonna, Christopher Colon. So Columbus's people is already in the Vatican. He's a cousin of that family. They go to Cologne. They have different differentiations in the name. They have Cologne with the G in Germany. They have Colonna in Italy. They have Cologne in Spain. That is how all Jewish names work throughout different regions, because the vowels don't matter when you're in a West Semitic language. They know how to read the ciphers through just the consonantal roots in the Abjad languages. Okay? That's like Aramean. That's like early Arabic. That's like Hebrew. Now, when we get over here, he gets his money in 1492, but they act like he gets it from King Isabella and Ferdinand, but he doesn't. Now history knows, A, Columbus's DNA was Jewish. B, on both sides. B, they find out now that he was funded by by rich Spanish Jews and some Italian Jews. So he was funded by Jews. And he gets, somehow, his trip starts the same year that 1 million people get exiled out of fucking Spain. Oh. Why? Because Columbus would have needed soldiers. You can't just colonize with nobody. So who do you send? You send the historical people that know navigation. The Arabs had a 500-year stronghold on the Navy. They were the early Euros that took over. They were using the Islam's maritime knowledge, their ports. They were taking over what Islam already had, but Islam wasn't using it as extensively as a slave network, especially what they had planned in store and coming next. All right. So the Portuguese, but I'm not saying that we have to understand Islam and these Persians over here were slaving this entire region for 2,000 years. So I'm not saying they're absolved from slavery. This modern industrial-sized slavery, like at this extent, is done by these people after they take over. Now, they're using that maritime knowledge to get... Now, let's look. The Treaty of Tordesillas, come up here. 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas, that the Vatican allowed after the exile, after they get their 800,000 troops to go. Look, these are all the routes they went in 1492 from their exile. You see, they went to France as Huguenots. They went up to Amsterdam. They went over to the Americas. They got the islands. They got... And in these dates, 1498, they came over here. This direction, they went back to Egypt. They went back to the Ottoman Empire, which they came from earlier, from their Islamic takeover of the north. They went all the way to India, where they started some Indian communities in the 1500s. And then later, you'll see Portugal comes here in 1498. But the Spanish exile led to all these lines I'm showing you drawn out of Spain. They all led to different places. They came back to Khazarian lands. Follow my hand. They come back to Khazarian lands. They go back to Turkey. They go back to these regions, okay, that they knew. Now... Fast forward, 1501, what happens? In 1500, the Portuguese discover Brazil. In 1501, they have their fucking exile. Oh my God, are you seeing what's happening here? When they discover new land, they need to exile Jews to go settle those lands, and those Jews become the expert navigators that they always have been, and maritime merchants that can set up the industry, the slave trade that they have always ran. You see, Egypt, I skipped over this. Egypt, when we went over there earlier, Egypt in the early Roman and Greek era, they always used Jewish tax slavers and Jewish financial assets to handle the slaves in the regions that they took over. You understand? They would even slave some other Jews and collect the money from the Jews, who would be the exilarchs or Nazi princes, which would sell out leadership positions to the local government. They've always had their court Jews. They don't give a fuck about Jews. Okay? The Colonialism family in Germany was exiling the other Jews, like we talked about earlier. They were exiling the Jews that would come over to Italy. They were in Germany. They would exile them and not let them live in certain cities, or they banned them from certain cities because they didn't want competition. That's in the History of the Jews, German version. The German History of the Jews, 1800s. They explain that, okay? And that's from the GNM letters. So it's important. It's coming from Babylon, talking to Italians. Now, so in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas splits the world. So all of the East is Portuguese. All of the West is Spaniard, okay? Now, this was the old hub of the Islamic power in the North. For 7 centuries, full of Arabs and Jews, what do we start to see on the East Coast of America? We start to see Arabic / Islamic and Jewish synagogues built together. You start to see some of that old world building that people claim is Tartaria. That is Arabic and Sephardic. That's Sephardic Jews and white Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, creating their synagogues that were also their mosques. So they have those dome temples. They're both serving there. And eventually, in the early wars between Britain, Spain, and France, they're destroying each other's buildings. That's not a bunch of Native Americans that were building that. Okay, let's go back. 1500, they get Port Brazil. They're already spending decades before any exile doing scouting missions, enslaving people by force. Not any different than they did when they were Phoenicians, or when they were Radanites, or when they were Islamic assassins. They were always working in a global slave trade. And there's always been a merchant Semitic class that can handle it. Now, the empire of Europe, which was now Habsburg German Empire, right? All the kings at this point were having infiltrations from the Habsburgs in Germany, where they were putting their bloodlines in all the royalty. So Spain had Habsburgs, and then a lot of these countries had Habsburgs, and then their cousins like Medicis, who they would intermarry in Rome. The Medicis were crypto Jews from Spain, wool merchants. See, the wool merchant trade for all of 1000 to 1500 was for sure a Jewish merchant trade, and it was based on slavery. So they've been experts in dye, cotton, slavery, and the manufacturing process around that for all of human history. Like, so when kings need a court, they always ask for a Jewish court from a previous empire to come in because they're already knowledgeable on how to tax the people at the maximum interest rates, how to collect and set up the government and society, how to control the ideology through their scribes. You need people with expertise in these different fields. But then, so if you understand all of the colonial era, you have to follow this method. They were acting like Portuguese and Spain were battling, and the Vatican had to make a claim to give them peace, so they split the world for them. The Catholic Church ordained it, so Spain would go that way, Portugal would go that way. Portuguese get to India in 1498, they get to Brazil in 1500, 1501, they had their goddamn exile. So you can see clearly what happens here. They needed to seed colonization, and all these fucking colonies got slaves everywhere. So what happens next? These maritime families that are colonizing different places, like the Virginia Company for the British and for Spain, that they're corporations, then become hubs in Amsterdam, okay? And in Amsterdam, you have and look how close Amsterdam is to England. People don't act like there's some huge leap for Jews to control one area or the next when they're fucking a swim away from each other. These are the most mobile people the world has ever known. There's nothing like the Jew mobility. On boat, on horse, there's nothing like it. The roads are their roads. When they say they built the world we own, they built the taken over world for sure. And every foundational road and map and maritime route is already predated by the Vikings in the east, in the west, and the Radanites in the east, which had trade to China. The Radanites were working for European kings. Some of them called Nazi princes, which means they were also in the Jewish leadership and the governmental collection of taxes and management of the Jews living in those kingdoms. So these are not just regular trader Jews. They act like Radanites were just some low-key whisper for 200 years. They were already embedded into these governments. They always left out of France in the Verdons area. They were the El Radania. And those routes that they act like these explorations happened, they were using old Arabic and Jew maritime routes they already had. It was just a matter of fact, it was just a matter of building the maritime assets, building the ships and increasing their ship capabilities to be ready for this. But they already knew these routes because their navigators, their scribes have known these fucking routes for millennia. The Canaanites, remember, they found out in 2025, had deep sea travel since 1500 BC. They could travel and navigate stars. The Canaanites are the Phoenicians. The Canaanites were getting dye from Spain. They were getting dye from Spain in 1500 BC, and people estimate that they know they have copper mines and other trading locations up here. So some people think the Canaanites are coming up here in possibly 2000 BC, which matches the Bell Beaker wave that came from the east. It matches, right? And it matches some of the origin stories of the Irish people and the invasions that they had. And it's no different than when the Phoenicians came with the Celtics and settled in Galatia here, like they used to have Galatia in Turkey, and they set up Brittany, and they set up America, and they let it go set up America. These are all interconnected networks, and what they're acting like is just a bunch of different kings leading their individual people. It's a network of cousins leading the royalty, the presidents, the houses of nobility, the merchant trades, and the slavery classes. They're running it at every single level. So don't think that there was some real battle between the Portuguese and Spain. Their royals were cousins. And every royal in Europe was a cousin. So we're dealing with a cabal, a network of family members who don't die in these wars 99% of the time. They profit on both sides. But those kings are puppets for us. And the scribes are actually who's in charge. So let's talk about England in 1560s England. You have the ancestor of Bill Gates, the three Gates brothers in England as the courtiers of King Edward VII, who's a 9-year-old. They're in his ear. 2 of them get killed, and then the Gates runs off, and then you see the Gates line over here in America, in Rhode Island, and they're running a slave farm, the Israel Gates slave plantation. Why are they having a slave farm? Because the Jews have been mastering, and those courtiers, an advisor, a courtier, we've been saying this whole series, When you hear a courtier, you hear a vizier, 90% of the time they're a Jew. The financiers, the advisors, the courtiers, it's always a court Jew, a rich family, some merchant rich family that's giving money. And those families have long tracked histories. But Bill Gates comes from that section. You have all the other nobility that we talked about, the Norman Viking kings that eventually descended down and led to the lords, the House of Lords, and to the Lords Proprietors. So then when England is settling America, they're setting up Lord Proprietorships, right? Which are tracts of land they're giving to lords who are cousins of the people in the House of Lords or selected from that same ilk. So the Lords Proprietors and the House of Lords or House of Balls, because a baron, a ball, a lord, they're the same thing. A Kyrios or Dominus. We talked about this. Now, when they take America, they're setting up tracts of land for their cousins. And then what are we getting again at this time? Now we're getting the Puritan expulsion. We're getting the Quaker expulsion. When you're hearing people get expelled, they are Jews already. And they are a mobile class of people. So the Protestants went from Huguenots to Protestants. Then from Protestants over to the Americas. The Quakers went and teamed up with Huguenots and left over to the Americas with William Penn. William Penn himself, super rich, like Bill Gates. He was the richest man of his time and had 28 million acres. How did he get his wealth? His father, a shipping company captain, working for Britain, became the captain of the Navy. Now, William Penn's mother was an Amsterdam heiress. She's a rich-ass woman. And then they combined the land they had in all of Ireland and New Amsterdam, and their family then got Pennsylvania because his father, William Penn's father, the Quaker king, his father was one of the richest men in England. He lended money to the king. Who lends money to kings? Who's master maritime men? When you're hearing these stories, you're not realizing you're dealing with a Jew either from 100 years ago or from a multi-millennial Jewish family that has converted over into the local government's religion. Okay? Nobody can match them maritime. Nobody can match them in merchantry. When you're hearing about a scribe, a translator, somebody that's multilingual, that's always a Jew. Okay, or an Arabic Jew Mithrist in the cabal of the older scribesmen. They're not really Jews because they're older than Jews. They made up Jews. Jews are another fake bullshit religion like Christianity is in Islam, right? They're broken off from older cults and shamans up here in the Yamnai range. So let's get back. So the Lords Proprietors are getting all these tracts of lands, and then their cousins who are running all these merchant ships are getting all the slaves. The corporations come from these boat captains, right? They're the ones stealing all this wealth. Like the Dutch India Company came over here and stole $45 trillion, or the British India Company, so English India Company, they steal $40 trillion or something from India. They also take all a bunch of slaves. And they move slaves to different countries to work colonies. When they discover sugar, they start making the most violent slave. They couldn't grow sugar in Europe because of the weather, so they started making sugar plantations in all the islands, and then they would move slaves all over the place. But they're working for their cousins over here, who become what? George Washington, our founding fathers, who are Freemasons. Freemasonry starts in Scotland, that Scottish area with the Freemasons who were builders, those Freemasons who used Judaism as the basis of their entire network. Those Freemasons were a trade guild at first. The trade guilds become their own secret little societies and groups trying to maneuver in society, usually ran by who? Who runs trade? Who runs merchantry? You don't understand. Okay, and the weavers and dyers are always Jews, and those weavers and dyers got a lot of wealth because the kings would pay them for their colors and for the art that they could make. Who masters that? Always been the Phoenicians with their dyes, who are also the alchemists who are making the occult books. They're also, we're getting off track. When they take these countries, so we're basically having a bunch of nobles that own millions of acres all over America and Latin America and then North Africa, and then they start dishing out different tracts of land for their families as colonizers. And then the 1800s, the Whig Party decides, we're having too many revolts everywhere. This shit's getting too expensive. We have enough family in all these countries. Let's rule our 170 nations from the back. So then you start seeing Whig Party members in America, like the Dulles Early family, the Secretary of States, a lot of other people in the early families of the settlers that were from England and Scotland and Ireland, from that whole WASP access of power with Freemasons, fake-ass Protestants, and banking families and merchant families. Now, those people then later become the Dutch India Company, the South Africa Royal Company, which managed all the slavery out of South Africa. All those 10 or 20 corporations become today's BlackRock. Today's Vanguard, today's Blackstone. The descendants of those people now have control of all the wealth, and their family are still literally nobles and lords all over the fucking world. We still call them lords. They're still called sirs. They're still called knights. They're fucking still managing old lands from a distance while acting like they're part of our local governments or part of just the communities they live in. They're working and paying tax back up to the top sources who are Habsburgs in Germany and British Euro families, who have always been cousins with Ottoman royal families and Mongol royal families and Persian royal families. You understand? It's a cabal. So when people say Jews, it's not Jews. The scribes were a network of different, even Buddhists, Hindus, working with Zoroastrian Muslims, working with Jews. That 5-group religion on the Silk Road, then controlling Hinduism, Buddhism, then Buddhism here, then later they get to Korea and give Korean Japan their bullshit and their metallurgy, right? And they're writing much later. So we got to get to this access, this Silk Road. They make a thing where there's, imagine traveling shaman, banker, slavers, okay? So the 5 big religions had the scribes for all the other little branch-off religions. They'd always make some local controlled op to give somebody. And then later in the 1900s and 1800s, they start to give us people like Castro. which are part of the noble families of Spain, but they're the heroes later for us now, right? So this is a constant stream of basically slave extraction, fake ideology, and ideological justification or purpose for their dispersal, and until the point we see that Britain sent these Jews to Israel in the 1940s or 20s, which was even more colonialism by empire. They act like they lost control, but what happened in the 1920s when they were bringing those Jews? They had a deal signed called Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot gave them old Babylonia, old Assyria, their whole network they used to always have, what Egypt would call Jenu in the Bronze Age. They gave them this land, right? When the news came out that a few member power countries, a few NATO member power countries, or not NATO, the UN at that time, they were trying to take control of this region. When word came out, they had to take it back to the background again. So then they started putting their own leaders in this region. First Turkish president, a Jew. They started putting the royal family in Saudi Arabia. That was a slaving Islamic family riding around on horses, still catching women and slaves in the 1800s. They were like, you know what? You'll be the royal family. You manage Saudi Arabia for us, which is insane. So then we act like Saudi Arabia is a problem, but then you see why the Bush family is best friends with the Bin Laden family, and they're all working together in the same network. The old Radnite to Viking to then they become the Templars and they become the assassins, and then they both working extracting fucking taxes and working temple banking for the powers in Islam and the powers in the Christian church. That's what's happening here. So people think they can run to a religion, and these religions created to manage regional bullshit, like the lies of a religion, right? They are controlling us through ideology to empower this system and maintain this system where the nobility has divided the world in a new 1494 table of nations. There's no coincidence that 1494 happens, 1492 happens, 1492 is the Spanish Golden Age, 1492 is when Columbus lands here, 1485 Columbus starts a gold slavery area, so it's like, guess what, I know about slavery, let me go start this access of a fucking North Atlantic slave trade. And then what does Europe do? They glorify him like he's the greatest man that ever lived. He gets put on a giant column in New York City as the king, the unconquered sun on top of a column, because he's from the column family, Colonna, and the colonialist family that keeps pillars in their house from supposedly the temple in Judea when they were temple bankers. These are Pharisees like Paul giving us stories so we can spread and justify the same insane Abrahamic colonial identity that has been the problem for 4,300 years on earth. Once they started writing down the books of the covenants with Mithraism, Zoroastrianism, and the books of the they weren't writing that. The oral history was a covenant history. We need to go back to that. They're enslaving people's minds after they invade and take out the paternal lines, and they enslave the women. So this is this new mythology for each region. But let's get back to the 1800s. After all this was settled and all these new people are in all these places, what do they need next? The next thing they need is a way to keep all these people invested in staying here and maintaining the order. So to do that, they would create in Italy, the height of decadence and sick fucking... I don't want to go to Italy. If we talk about Italy, we have to talk about the Vatican. We have to talk about how they're built on top of the Necropolis. We have to talk about the Mithraism that's really under the Vatican. We have to go back to one of the biggest problems that have ever happened in humankind. But in Italy in the 1800s, a nobleman by the name of Giovanni Mazzini gets this supposed revelation. They start giving people this new nationalism mythology. And he creates the Young Irish Society. Then he creates the Young Turk. No, he creates Young Irish, then Young Europe, and the Young Italy and Young France movements. Those movements in the 1848 era, in the 1800s, those movements would lead a bunch of nationalism for people that were being shifted all about. Nobody was really where they were from because there was 500 years of war in Europe and everybody was getting migrated consistently and merged in with Jews that had to convert into the religions, and then everybody's getting mixed together. But Mazzini in the 1800s, he's writing the doctrine. His mother's a rich woman that can't trace any further back. Okay? His father's in the church. Okay? He's writing letters to Albert Pike and the KKK. Albert Pike has a plan in the 1860s that was discovered in 1955 about the 3 world wars and how we foment them. How it would start off with a war against Germany, and then a war against Nazis, and then the 3rd World War where it was Zionism versus Islam versus atheists, all in a battle. Well, what's he doing? Mazzini, in those letters, you look into Mazzini, what's he doing? He's creating a nationalist ideology for all these different people. And the subsets of that ideology go on to become things like Young Turks, who would then go on to kill everybody in Turkey. All those Armenians that got murdered. The Young Turks come from the ideology that led to Young Europe, that came from Young Europe. Now, here's what's even crazier. After a while, the Young Turks murders are happening, and the Young Turks are taking over, and the Don Maids and Sabbatai Zevi, we have to go back to in a second. Let's go back to Sabbatai Zevi right now. The corporations that were running all this slavery, from their elk, from their descendants, comes Sabbatai Zevi. His father worked for those corporations. Sabbatai Zevi is connected to a lot of networks, like the Hasmonean League, a trading league in Europe that was Jewish, the Bremen League, another trading league in Europe that was Jewish. He's tied to a lot of these super hyper-mobile people in Europe. And what he does is he is creating Frankism, some early Frankism version, where it's like the opposite of good, to bring in the Messiah faster. They call him the Messiah, right, in 1666. Half the world's Jews are following his cult, okay? And in that cult, he goes to Turkey, where Mehmed IV, who's a grandson of an Ottoman sultan who allowed the Jews to come after the 1491 thing, and then he made it illegal to talk about Jews. So you have to question his grandfather. And then his mother is Roxana, who was an infiltrator from Ukraine, who was a slave bride at a 50, who becomes the first fucking empress that could marry a sultan from slavery, a redhead girl from Khazaria. You know what I told you.